Hi, this is just a quick little introduction to this is a test video for my professor to review because I cannot send the file. Now, there are some successful games and some not so much. With Resident Evil, you end up seeing a lot of both. I'm your host, K.S.P from the Game and Society class, and we are going to be talking about the rebirth of the Resident Evil franchise. Blog Fansided states, why Resident Evil is still a success over 2 decades later. This statement was carried by a PS1 game Resident Evil 2 remake at the E3 2018 conference. Don't believe that's the only reason. Some games that brought down their downfall though, like Code Veronica and Resident Evil 0, truly were not the greatest after their previous installments. After a decade, several attempts with these games of old puzzle solving and outdated scenarios were truly not what the community wanted. Though, the true uprising of Resident Evil was way back in 2005 with Resident Evil 4. Following along with the story of fan favorite Leon Kennedy and new characters, inventory system, fans decided to really fall back in love with Resident Evil. Later, we see the game go back in the dark when in Resident Evil 5, they try to use elements from Resident Evil 4. Sadly, seeing it in the dark until Resident Evil 7. Once again, Resident Evil changing up their tactics, and they're moving into a first-person horror, alongside new story elements and new characters like Ethan Winters. Which breaks down into a new set of events like Resident Evil 8, which is one of the biggest still fan favorites. And not just shying away from Resident Evil and Resident Evil 8, they made a huge success with making a Resident Evil 7 virtual reality, which was one of the top sellers that were unexpected to the community. Now, after going over some of the downfalls like Code Veronica and Resident Evil 0 and some uprising games like Resident Evil 4 and Resident Evil 7 and 8, we'll be going back to discuss what's so important about Resident Evil 2, the remake. Now, I'm not going to leave out Resident Evil 3, but during this time that the article was made, I do want to discuss how Resident Evil 2 was a fan favorite, a deep spot in everyone's hearts. Not saying that Resident Evil 3 wasn't, but everyone was so excited and thrilled about how Resident Evil 2 brought back their favorite characters, Leon and Ada Wong. Among being a fan favorite, we have old story elements that were renewed, repurposed, and eventually was brought to the new era. This was a great new coming to older fans, but also was a great way to introduce other fans, someone that has never been a part of the franchise before, or someone that just never got to experience the classic PS1 game. Which can be said the same about Resident Evil 3, of its previous old characters, its old fans being brought to a new light. Some arguments I would like to make is why some games work and some didn't. Capcom really tried to enhance the storyline, try to stretch out everything with Code Veronica and Resident Evil 0, and for some reason it wasn't as a success. Maybe it was the timeline of when these games came out, or genuinely they were just not that interesting, not appealing, and didn't develop much of what the community wanted. Now, I believe with a lot of failure that Capcom has gone through, it allowed themselves to think out of the box, learn new tactics. So when it comes to reaching out to new communities or finding new fans, they have to look towards creating new elements, which I believe is why they succeeded so well in the future. I also want to bring in some opinions, what I agree with, and some things that I think should always stick with the franchise. Some things like how the change of elements from first person, third person, some revised games that were previously outdated but still among fan favorites should always be something any sort of franchise should ever follow. Though hopefully I am excited for the new release of Resident Evil 4 Remake makes headlines with new tactics but also some old story elements and classic Resident Evil puzzles. I'll round this topic off with commending Capcom for their recent success and further progression in the community after their downfalls, and I hope to see some great and new incoming games. I'm your host, Caleb Stock, and thank you for tuning in on why Resident Evil is still a success over 2 decades later.